As a long-time fan of the Fallout franchise, it's been great to see so many new people falling in love with this universe, following the release of the Prime Video series. The Fallout TV show, in short, does a fantastic job of capturing the style and tone that makes the game so special. It's not perfect by any means, but realistically none of the games are either. Each and every Fallout story has its positives and its negatives, and whether you've enjoyed all or simply a few of them, everyone will have their favourites. Where quality varies somewhat though, every Fallout entry has given something new to the fans, expanding the world and deepening the story in the process. And now I think the show has done that too. Seeing the world of Fallout represented in this new way has also raised a big question for me, which I'd like to discuss in some detail. Just what is it that makes Fallout so brilliant? I don't think there's an easy answer to that question, nor do I think it will be the same explanation for everyone. But I do think that this fictional universe is extraordinary enough that it warrants deeper exploration into anything and everything that sets it apart, in order to explain why so many people love Fallout so much. Why it works, how it works, and what is required to tell a good Fallout story, now and into the future. Like most fictional universes which have existed long enough to foster a large group of casual fans and hardcore obsessives, the stories and details have evolved and changed over the years, but I don't think the fundamentals ever have. From the first game all the way up to today, Fallout has offered a unique post-apocalyptic adventure, rich in detail and deep in character, which plays with the same thematic ingredients to remain mostly consistently brilliant. So, starting at a macro level and slowly digging into the details, I'm going to attempt to decipher what makes Fallout so great, and what makes it tick, in my mind at least. And maybe, in the process, offer some insight into what makes any franchise worth loving.
Gary! Ah, Gary. Gary! Gary!
At the centre of most every good story, there is a clear-cut premise. A thesis which the tale essentially aims to prove. It might not be obvious, but it is almost certainly there, and it is important. With a single self-contained story, it's usually pretty easy to tell what's going on. But with a huge franchise like Fallout, where stories coexist across time and space, it's arguably less clear. Still, I think it's important that while each individual journey has its own unique angle, they all combine in the end into a unified, cohesive premise. Usually then, for many stories to weave together into an expansive fiction, this premise necessarily has to be quite broad and straightforward. In Jurassic Park, nature proves too powerful to be controlled or contained by man. In Star Wars, good always eventually triumphs over evil. In Harry Potter, good also triumphs over evil. And in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, good triumphs over evil. Quite often, when you get down to brass tacks, the premises of these huge IPs will involve good triumphing over evil. That's not to say it's a bad thing though, because if it works, and they do plenty otherwise to distinguish themselves as stories. These sorts of exceptionally generic premises seem like they shouldn't be that helpful to understanding why a franchise works. And yet they're the key to the fundamental drive of every story. Imagine if the MCU had ended things with Avengers Infinity War, and not given its heroes the chance to restore life to the universe and defeat Thanos for good. It might be considered brave storytelling, but it wouldn't be in line with the premise of that world. Sacrifices might be needed to defeat evil, and it might take some time, but it has to happen eventually, or else the audience will be left feeling cheated. Some premises, of course, prove over time that they actually can't sustain a franchise long term. I think the perfect example is the well-known declining quality of the Die Hard films, where McClane's transition from downhearted family man and regular cop into a certified badass doesn't really work past the first few films. Bringing it back to Fallout then, what is the central premise that unites all of the stories in this post-apocalyptic world? Does good always defeat evil here? Well, sort of, sometimes, but that doesn't really cover it. Without spoiling the plots of any of the specific games, I will say that you can functionally succeed in your adventures at defeating one evil, but in the process you'll likely wind up dead, banished, getting innocent people killed, destroying incredible technology, or worse. And in the show, again without specifics, it's clear that victory comes at a cost. So there's always sacrifice in some form, but the other important caveat which ties into that is that the big bad in Fallout isn't usually all evil. There are most definitely some pure evil people in this world, but the vast majority have some redeeming quality in their design for rebuilding the wasteland. Everyone who is seeking power here employs varying degrees of good and bad behaviour. If I really had to nail down the core premise of Fallout then, based on the way I've experienced these stories, I'd say it's simply this. Defeating something evil requires sacrificing something good. In a sense, this premise embodies the futility of striving to make the world a better place in Fallout. Everything achieved comes at a cost, and few things are black and white. I think this is a rule that applies to most, if not all, Fallout stories, and I think it's usually executed exceptionally well. There is hope and optimism in this world, but it is tempered by the harsh realities of life in the wasteland.
It was a piece of cake. I'm glad you feel that way, because it only gets more difficult from here.
If we define the premise as the central rule of the franchise, then I'd describe the themes instead as the specific thematic threads that the Fallout universe contends with. If the centre of the story is about the sacrifice required for victory, then as we delve deeper, we have to consider the recurrent ideas and questions which help flesh out this world. In no specific order then, I believe they would include the power of the atom, far-fetched feats of technology, bureaucracy and corporate power, mid-century optimism, hubris and excess, propaganda, war and hope. I'm sure there's more I'm forgetting or phrasing badly, but I think that covers a lot of it. What's interesting then, thematically, about the Fallout universe is how it filters the optimistic visions of the past through the post-apocalypse. It balances retrofuturism with death and destruction and results in magnificent absurdity. The world of Fallout represents the absolute extremes of the best and worst of humanity. Incredible technical achievements used to destroy civilization. Groundbreaking cryo-freezing tech, preserving the most evil people alive. An absurdly impressive network of survival shelters used to experiment on the last remnants of society rather than save them. Each and every faction in the wasteland has a unique idea for how they would rebuild the world. And a lot of the main stories in Fallout revolve around some object which represents the power to enact their plans. In New Vegas, it's the Platinum Chip. In Fallout 3, Project Purity. And then there are things like the Gek, or in the show, Cold Fusion. All of these serve to accelerate the ascension of one of many ideologies in the wasteland, and often the player gets to choose which, but necessarily, as the premise goes, I don't think there's ever a perfect choice. The factions all represent some part of the thematic tapestry though. The Brotherhood values old world technology. The NCR values order and civility. Raiders hope for chaos, the Enclave hangs on to fascist ideologies, and the Railroad believe in freedom at any cost. All of these things exist too in a world where most are simply struggling to survive. That in itself is another imbalance. that the Vaults or the Brotherhood hoard technology and food in the name of rebuilding the world while refusing to help struggling wastelanders. This universe, just like before the bombs fell, is locked in an eternal conflict with no obvious resolution. I understand some people are upset that in the TV show they blew up Shady Sands, given how important it was in the first 2 games. This only felt too right for me though, in-universe. Shady Sands and the NCR were getting too big and important to possibly stay like that for long. It's actually all in that oh so important line that is central to Fallout. Ron Perlman didn't tell us that war sometimes changes. He told us that war never changes. So why should Shady Sands survive? If it were me, I probably would have blown up Shady Sands on camera early in the season, rather than leave it as backstory, because I think that could have been majorly cool. But anyway, New Vegas is a wonderful example of the everlasting conflict because it's all condensed within that city. In a sense, it seems more civilized than the majority of settlements throughout the wasteland as a result. But really, the city exists in an uncomfortable balance where each faction is only biding their time and waiting for their moment to seize power. There are countless examples of power struggles within this universe, and always against the backdrop of simple survival. Beyond the wasteland though, what else could represent the clash between human achievement and lust for power better than the nuclear bombs which serve as the inciting incident for the whole franchise? They are a technical achievement, yes, but they also grant the ultimate power over life itself. Obviously though, the bombs could not have been fired without retaliation here. Every choice presented to any character in this universe centers on the question of what does being a good person cost me? And do I ultimately care more about the fate of the human race or the power that I can attain? A lot of these thematic elements for me can boil down to 2 sides of a coin characterizing the human dichotomy. No matter how much potential the future has, humanity can still find a way to screw it up. And even when things are at their worst, the human spirit refuses to give up.
It's enough to make a player rethink what it means to win. You're 18 karat, baby, all the way.
With any story in any world, the details matter, but I don't think they ever matter more than the whole. Each of the Fallout games and the TV show feature an abundance of glorious details. And while, as a fan, it's exciting to bask in the glory of a beautifully crafted Nuka-Cola bottle, or an incredible design for an in-universe movie poster, what actually matters most in the larger context of the world and any individual story contained within is how those details contribute to the distinct character of the universe. Everything in the world of Fallout derives from the premise and themes first and foremost, and in doing so relates back to a believable and grounded alternate reality. Most of the props and art design are in some way referencing back to the aforementioned contrasting themes. The cars are intricately designed retro beauties, but they're also nuclear powered. Sugar bombs are a delicious cereal designed to look like weapons of mass destruction. Power armor is the height of technology, but with a fatal flaw overlooked by the suits in charge. Most everything ties into the story in some way. I don't think anyone needs to obsess too much over the minutiae in this post-apocalyptic world. But without those details, it would lose a great deal of character, as they are essentially embodying the themes of this universe. Though I won't linger on them too long, the important thing with all the details in the games and the show is one simple rule. That every nook and cranny, every object, every car, sign, song or building should feel like it originates from this universe. Often it makes sense that something should closely resemble an object in the real world. The typewriters make sense looking like the typewriters we know in the real world, but other times something more distinct is needed. Either way, it's about filling the world with details which never distract from the world building, but ideally add something to it instead. I know as fans it's easy to get caught up in the details, and while I do think they're important, they obviously don't matter more than the whole in the end.
I think you're the murderer. The brain enclosure was smashed in, and your bat was at the scene of the crime.
What? That makes no sense at all.
I said before that I think the TV show nailed the tone of the Fallout universe, and I stand by that. But I think it's reasonable to ask what tone really means here, and how exactly the show is able to get it right. I find it a little bit difficult to explain what tone really is, because it's really just about the overall vibe that something has. The way that watching or playing makes you feel, and the overall atmosphere created by that experience. It's not something that's easy to explain then, but it is the most important and obvious thing that matters to a player or viewer. The best way I can think to explain how the tone is achieved then is to simply say that it emerges successfully when the end product equals more than the sum of its parts. When everything works together and all originates from its central premise, then everything feels tonally consistent. The premise matters a lot, of course, but alone it lacks the distinct character of the franchise. The themes are important, but without structure or function, they're nothing. The details matter too, but in isolation they mean very little. But when the story fits the premise, the character fits the world, the music is just right, the costumes are appropriate, the comedy is there without being excessive, and the rules of the world are clear, everything comes together to deliver the right tone. So much of the TV format is so different from games that, in translation, they could have very easily messed this up, as many other adaptations already have. But by staying true to the fundamental rules of the franchise, and staying consistent, they made it work. As a fan of the games who expects things a certain way, it would have been off-putting, for example, if Default Codsworth had had an Australian accent in the show. It isn't off-putting to learn where his voice came from though, because that makes sense and feels right within the context. The show has to branch out from established canon to offer anything of value, but it does so, like all the games before it, by rooting itself firmly in the established lore. We had never seen the connected vaults of 31 to 33 before, but in execution it works because it builds off what's already there in a direction which fits the premise. There are, in fairness, some things in the show which don't feel quite as appropriate to this world, just like there are some oddities in the games. I wasn't totally sure about the way they required the ghoul to frequently imbibe vials of yellow liquid in order to stop himself from going feral. I figured at first that it was supposed to be Radaway, but apparently it's something new, and though the ghoul rules have never been totally clear, I feel the way they handled them in the show generally felt a little bit odd. Still, the issues are only minor things like that, and not enough to hurt the tone overall. Fallout 76, on the other hand, made a much bigger mistake which I think hurt the tone of that game overall a lot more. By not including interactable NPCs at launch, it felt tonally wrong to me. If I try to imagine some of the other mistakes that a Fallout story could make which would hurt the tone, they would include offering an ending where everyone lives happily ever after, making in-universe branding overly serious or generic, playing modern music or featuring modern set dressing, having someone living in the wasteland behave like a normal person, finding a settlement which functions perfectly without any evil undertones, discovering a pre-war company didn't have sinister ulterior motives, Brotherhood of Steel members being polite and easygoing. And finally, I think the worst thing a Fallout story could do would be to change war. Obviously, that's not an exhaustive list, but I hope it's clear that all of those things are, in one way or another, antithetical to the Fallout universe. I'll also say, by the way, that the smartest decision they made with this TV show was simply staying consistent with the pre-existing games and that universe, rather than starting from scratch or retelling an existing story. I think an adaptation which involves a franchise reboot like the Halo series is a truly terrible idea, not just because it upsets and confuses fans of the original series, but also because it forces them to choose a favourite or canon universe from the two, and nobody is going to pick the show. When they reboot a franchise like that, it feels like they start making creative decisions simply to differentiate themselves. And that's a terrible idea too. When you have a well-established, well-loved franchise and you decide to reboot it, you're immediately setting yourself up to fail. Luckily then, the Fallout show didn't do that. For the sake of this discussion, I figured it was important to avoid spending too long discussing the innate quality of the individual Fallout products, to focus on the franchise as a whole instead. Obviously, a franchise with only terrible stories to tell across any medium is going to struggle to succeed. But generally speaking, a bad story doesn't have to detract from the whole world. I think that Amazon's Rings of Power show is bad, but it doesn't detract from my enjoyment of the Lord of the Rings books or films. Still, a healthier franchise is one where most of the stories are at least considered good-ish. On an individual level, I think that each product has to tell a functionally cohesive story from beginning to end. And for all except the first story, it has to match the tone of the pre-existing universe. In a sense then, that first story has to be great enough that it sets a standard that even warrants expanding into a franchise in the first place. I doubt Forspoken will ever become a successful franchise because it didn't make a very good first impression. You had probably completely forgotten it before I said its name just then, or maybe even never heard of it in the first place. In a situation like that, any sequel would have to change a fair amount and take all sorts of new risks to potentially justify expanding that world into a franchise in the first place. But it's rare that happens. Luckily, in Fallout's case, that first game was a winner in almost every sense, and it has clearly served as a blueprint for every Fallout story going forward. But certainly there is plenty of flexibility there, and I think that's chiefly because the premise and themes are so expansive. Fallout paints a picture of the futility of human progress and how we carry on despite it. Even in the worst situations, there's always potential there. I don't think the world of Fallout ever feels like a hopeless place, like so much post-apocalyptic fiction offers. There's a sense that one could make a whole new start, and yet there's always that likelihood that it will fall apart in the end. The world is crammed with factions, some good, some evil, but most in the middle somewhere, and everybody has a different idea of how to rebuild, but none of them are perfect. I won't pretend here that I've cracked the code and discovered some secret reason for why Fallout is so great, because I think the truth is probably pretty straightforward in the end. Fallout is great because the people telling the stories in this world care about everything. The first game set the standard, and from that point on, have sincerely cared about getting the stories and the world right. I think they've paid attention to the premise, the themes, and the details that I've discussed here, and have genuinely wanted to expand and add to that world. We can only hope that, looking to the future, the creatives in charge of this franchise continue to care this much. But what do you think? What makes Fallout so great for you? And what's your favourite story in this universe? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you'd like to hear me talk about more video game stuff. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.